This chapter is covering blood. The components of blood include several different elements, the first of which is erythrocytes, which are called red blood cells. Now, when blood is taken from your arm, it's then put into a centrifuge, which is going to reveal three components. What they do is use gravity to spin the most densest elements to the bottom of the test tube. And those elements would include three different parts. The erythrocytes are the red blood cells, and they make up of about 44% or so of the blood sample. Just above that is what's called the buffy coat. It's a middle layer which contains both leukocytes, which are white blood cells, as well as platelets, which are cell fragments. And this makes up approximately 1% of the blood sample. Above that, then, we have a straw-colored substance called plasma, which makes up about 55% of the blood. So the erythrocytes, leukocytes, and platelets, those combinations are collectively referred to as the formed elements. This slide is showing us that process where first whole blood is removed from a vein. It's removed from a vein because those are the most superficial of the blood vessels. It's placed into a centrifuge and spun. And what we see is in the diagram to the right here. At the bottom of the test tube, we see erythrocytes accounting for 44% of the whole blood. There's quite a bit of erythrocytes, between 4.2 and 6.2 million per cubic millimeter. Above that is the about 1% or maybe less than 1% called the buffy coat, and that's made up of leukocytes. And the different leukocytes in order of the greatest amount to the least is the neutrophils account for over half. Lymphocytes are 20 to 40%. Monocytes are 2 to 8. Eosinophils are 1 to 4. And basophils are 0.5 to 1%. A way that you can remember this is the mnemonic, never let monkeys eat bananas. And this is the number of leukocytes in order that we have by concentration. So the most concentrated would be the neutrophils, and you'll need to be able to identify them and know what their major function is. So that's 50 to 70% of the leukocytes. Then we have lymphocytes, which are 20 to 40%. Then monocytes, which now we're down into the single digits, 2 to 8%. Eosinophils, which are fairly rare, they're only 1 to 4%. And then finally, the most rare would be the basophils, which are only 0.5% to 1%. The other part of the buffy coat would be platelets, which are basically fragments of cells. Now, the last part is the plasma, which is 55% of the whole blood. By weight, 92% of it is water. The rest of it is proteins and other solutes. Those proteins include albumins, globulins, and fibrinogens. And the other solutes include things like electrolytes, nutrients, respiratory gases, as well as waste products. The functions of the blood are shown on this slide, and there are three main functions. The first one is called transportation, a super important one because in red blood cells, there's a protein called hemoglobin, which binds to oxygen and carbon dioxide. Also transported within the blood is our hormones, nutrients, and waste. The next function is regulation, which helps the blood to maintain its temperature, pH, and fluids in the cardiovascular system. So remember that the blood vessels are part of the cardiovascular system, But the blood itself is a very unique type of connective tissue. And it's very unique because it's the only type of connective tissue that has a matrix, which is actually fluid. The other types of connective tissue don't have a fluid connective tissue. So for the regulation function, it maintains the pH, and the pH has to stay around 7.4 in the blood. So specifically, the pH range is 7.35 to 7.45. Whenever it veers out of this important range, there is what's called a buffer system, which helps to prevent that. A pH below 7 is called acidic, and a pH above 7 is called alkaline. So pH imbalances would include acidosis as well as alkalosis. The last function of the blood is that of protection, which is super important. And one of the ways protection occurs is because of white blood cells called leukocytes. So you need to know that leukocytes are white blood cells, and there are 5 different ones, which we'll talk about later in this chapter. Those leukocytes guard against infection by triggering an immune response to antigens. And the antigens are small proteins which are on different cells like bacteria. And we'll talk more about those as well because all of our red blood cells have antigens on them. Blood also carries small proteins called antibodies, which would attack foreign antigens. So the plasma proteins, which are present in the plasma, include these 3: albumins, globulins, and fibrinogen. The albumins are the smallest and most abundant of the plasma proteins. They're very important for regulating water movement between the blood and interstitial fluid, also the transport of ions, hormones, as well as some lipids. The globulins, you don't need to know alpha and beta or gamma globulins, but you do need to know their main function is that they form antibodies used for the immune defense. The antibodies are going to be free-floating proteins within the blood plasma. Then finally, fibrinogen is responsible for clot formation, and it's converted to another protein called fibrin during the clotting process. And the other part of the plasma proteins would be regulatory proteins like enzymes. So blood plasma is 92% water, and water is that universal solvent that all the formed elements in proteins and solutes are suspended in. The plasma proteins includes the albumin, which exerts an osmotic force to retain water within blood. It's also responsible for some transportation of fatty acids as well as hormones. For globulins, their main job is that they play a role in antibodies that immobilize pathogens. Fibrinogen is important in blood coagulation, which is clotting. Also within the blood plasma, we have other solutes like electrolytes. These are things like sodium, potassium, calcium chloride, iron, bicarbonate, and hydrogen. And they do all kinds of things. They maintain blood pH, regulate osmosis, and are representative. They help to control the percentages of water and salt in the body. Various hormones are chemical messengers that travel in the blood, things like insulin, thyroid hormone, testosterone, estrogen. Nutrients are in the plasma, things like amino acids, glucose, cholesterol, and so on. Respiratory gases are oxygen and carbon dioxide. They could be in the plasma or they could be attached to the red blood cell. And finally, waste products are things like lactic acid, creatinine, urea, bilirubin, and ammonia. And they don't really have a function in plasma, but rather are transported to the liver and the kidneys for elimination.